This is Liberating Faith, a She Loves podcast. We are a chorus of voices creating space and weaving together the world we long for, a world that starts with love. This is for people who walk in a faith that remembers God is love. This is for people who want to live out a faith rooted and grounded in love. And as Maya Angelou reminds us, love liberates. Liberating Faith invites you into conversations, stories, and perspectives from around the globe. She Loves has always been about creating both safe and brave spaces on the internet, inviting a chorus of voices to create culture together. We embrace an anti-racist faith, a decolonizing faith, a feminist faith, an affirming faith, because we are liberated together. Here, may you feel rooted and grounded in love. May you be expanded in your listening. May something in you become a little more unbound. May something in you soften. May you find what you are looking for now. This is Liberating Faith. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Liberating Faith, a She Loves podcast. My name is Leah Abraham. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm the editor-in-chief of She Loves magazine, and I'm joining you from the land of the Pawtucket and the Massachusetts people, Boston, Massachusetts. And today I get the privilege of introducing you to Lindiwe Mpofu, who's also in our leadership team. Hi, Lindy.
Hi, Leah.
How are you doing?
I'm well. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Part of the reason I invited Lindy to chat with me is because I've been thinking a lot about concepts of home and origin stories and how that informs our faith. And Lindiwe and I are both immigrants.
Right.
We've experienced having to move not only countries, but continents and cultures. And I think immigrants we have to deal with this idea of like our understanding and idea of hope has to evolve and change.
Right.
Part of an identity thing, and it's also survival, but it does make you rethink about that. But I think I have this theory that like as your understanding and idea of home changes, so does your faith. It evolves sort of interconnectedly and vice versa.
Right.
And so I'm really curious to hear a little bit about your thoughts about that. But maybe to begin with, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Lindiwe Mpofu. Most people call me Lindy. My mother calls me Lindiwe when I'm in trouble. I was born in Zimbabwe. I lived in South Africa for a big chunk of my life. I'm currently living in Canada on Treaty 6 territory, which is the homeland of the Métis. I am a new immigrant. I have been living here for about 3 years, going on 4. I am an Enneagram 5, which I'm never entirely sure what that all involves. I am also a Libra, which I know a lot more about. Taken very seriously.
I'm a Sagittarius, if you're curious.
Oh, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah,
that's a great thing. I work with a nonprofit here in Saskatoon, as well as serving on the leadership of She Loves with some communications and marketing. Yeah, that's me.
Wow.
And I completely agree with that sentiment of home and the concept of home. One of my recent discoveries, if you will, is just how much the concept of home is really the most complicated thing in my life right now, the most complicated concept to try to put into words, to try to process what home means for my faith as well. So I'm really looking forward to unpacking this with you, Leah.
Well, you've moved to Canada about 4 years now. What do you consider home?
That's a great question. So one of my mentors, her name is Karen. She was a missionary. She still is a missionary, a child of missionaries. And she had served in different parts of Africa and Asia. She was born in the United States. And she worked with me for a significant portion of my adult journey as a Christian. And she would always describe herself as an orchid because orchids have their roots outside. So their roots grow out and not in. And I really decided to borrow that analogy to describe what home means to me, that I don't necessarily feel like I have my roots firmly planted in one place. And it's something that just running with that analogy is not as comforting as I hoped it would be because by unpacking what that means, right? I recently came back from a trip to South Africa, which I also consider home. And when I just landed, I felt like I was home. I felt like I had, my sense of gravity restored, a lot of displaced feelings that I had, especially with the pandemic and trying to navigate what life looks like here. A lot of that just fell away the moment I landed on South African soil, right? But then when I came back to Saskatoon, I also felt relieved. I felt relieved that I was home. I felt relieved that I didn't have to figure out flight details anymore. I felt relieved that I could settle into my routine, that my grocery list is the same, just that familiarity of home, right? So that's a very complicated, complex, more like a concept for me right now.
Yeah, I've been in the States now for 14 or 15 years at this point, so it's been a while. But I remember when I first moved, like, this did not feel like home. I was just like, I am just a guest right now in this space. And I was really looking forward to going back to India. And when I first went, and it was like about 4 years after I moved, I was like so surprised by how foreign India felt to me. I was like, I know the way of these streets. I know how to get to my home and stuff, but people had moved on, it felt like, and like the landscape was changing, and it just felt like I was visiting instead of coming home. And it was very fascinating coming back after that vacation, of being like, oh crap, this is my home now. And that was just sort of like a huge, it was so disorienting of like, I did not even realize what I considered home had changed and morphed. So I'm making that connection now to the imagery of the orchid, and I probably felt like that at that point.
Right.
Yeah, and now while the States do, like, this country does feel like home. Actually, it took me a long time to actually accept that this country felt like home.
Why do you think that is? Yeah, I'm curious to know.
Yeah, I think at first it had a lot to do with a lot of my just inner wounds about belonging. I never like believed that I belonged. I always waited for someone to tell me and then prove it to me that yes, you belong here.
Oh girl, yes.
And then I think it was in 2016 when Trump got elected as president of this country. I was like, I had this realization that like I have to take responsibility for what's happening here. While I did not vote for him and I did not want him to come to power, I can't just if I call this place my home and I call my neighbors my people, my community, like I have to take responsibility for the space I'm taking up, and if I want to do good to this land and the people around me, like there was that ownership piece that I was sort of clicking into place. And I was like, at this point, like I can't just say I'm out because it's inconvenient for me, or if I don't feel safe, like, right. And so that was like, that was when I was like, okay, I'm calling this my home, and I'm calling this my people. And so this is how I will take responsibility in my neighborhood, in my community. If that makes sense. So that was like a very like strong shift. And then I got married and I've been moving around for a little bit. And so home's just morphed into my partner, who's sort of, he's my safety net right now, right? And so that for me is what home is right now. And so it's morphing and changing, and it's really fascinating just as I was sort of thinking about our conversation and getting ready for it to like, oh crap, like a lot's happened in 15 years and just that's very strange.
15 years.
I know, I feel like I'm too young to say that 15 years has been I'm also curious to hear a bit more about how your faith has evolved, Lindy, especially I think just starting with your origin stories of your faith, because I know just even in South Africa and Zimbabwe, like you've had such a fascinating story. I'm wondering if you could share that with us.
Yeah, so I grew up in Zimbabwe as a child. I was part of a big ministry family. My granddad had been a missionary with the Church of Christ, that is a New Zealand denomination, a denomination that comes out of New Zealand. And he was just this tall Black man with a deep, loud voice and a Scottish accent. Very confusing, very interesting. And from that background, a lot of my extended family, my aunts, my uncles were always involved in the church. And so was my mom. My mom is a fire preacher. She also works as a social worker. So growing up, I just, as most PKs would feel, I felt like my faith wasn't really my own. It just was what you did, right? It was just good people believe in God. Good people follow these rules that are set out in the Bible. But I think I would have been around 8 or 9 when I actually started to own my faith. And that came out of questions and curiosity. I was that annoying 10-year-old that had so many questions to ask about why God this and where was God sitting when he had God created chairs before he created the rest of the thing? Like what? That was really important for me to know. Like what?
The most Enneagram 5 child thing I've heard.
Like I just needed to know. I wish Genesis had painted a bigger picture to know exactly what was going on.
Yeah.
And that curiosity led me to a faith in Christ. As a teenager, I rebelled, as most teenagers do, and then came back again to that ownership of faith. At that stage, I had then moved to South Africa, and that's where I went to university. I joined a student church, which was in Cape Town. Cape Town is a very interesting part of South Africa. The inequality is very stark there. They're very, very rich neighborhoods, just adjacent to like townships, which are shack communities, a lot of the time just shanty towns, for lack of a better word. I was part of a predominantly white church, a non-denominational congregation. I served there. I poured out, a lot of my energy. I found so much purpose in that church. I found purpose in the structure. And because I had come from this ministry background, right, I felt like, oh, finally, I was also fitting into this thing that's so important to my family. I too had a purpose in the church. So that was very important to me. And then in my late 20s, the world just started changing, right? That people were asking these questions that I hadn't interrogated before. And maybe this is also a 5 thing. The fact that there was a new question just made me halt. It brought me to a halt, right? So these questions in South Africa were around decolonization, around what the colony means to us in this side of the millennium. Those questions rocked my world. I just felt like I was looking for something solid, right? It felt like the ground beneath me was just shaking, and I was looking to the church for answers. I was pretty involved in the leadership of that church, in the student leadership. And I was asking, the leaders, the pastors, the senior pastors, a lot of these questions, and I was silenced, and there was just a lot of spiritual abuse that became apparent at that time. And it really shook me because I didn't understand why all of a sudden this curiosity around a certain thing, around race, around gender, and these hot button issues that really are people's real life experiences, why that was being pushed against with such force. That brought up so many issues in Leah, just so many things bubbled to the surface. My issues with authority, my issues with male figures of authority. And the only thing that I could do at that point to find some relief was to step away from the church. That led me to an unintentional, at the beginning, journey of deconstructing and intentionally seeking out what a decolonizing faith looked like. And then that overlapped with my transition to Canada, to life in Canada. So it's felt very lonely because there's a loneliness that comes with coming away from a community that you found so much purpose and identity and belonging in, and then moving away from that, and then moving further away to a new community altogether, a new nation, a new people. I found that to be the most shaping and the most challenging bit of my, defining what my faith looks like at this stage of my life.
I'm curious what role always suck at this word. Evangelicalism. Did I get it?
I think so. We'll go with that.
I'm curious what that was both in Zimbabwe and South Africa at the times you were growing up in. What was that like? Was it relevant? How that played a role?
Yeah, so a lot of denominations in Zimbabwe would have the word evangelical somewhere in it, just in the name, right? And it's this energizing word because it's about spreading the gospel and being out there. My grandmother used to tell stories of building churches with her hands in the village, and it was because she was part of this evangelical team in her church. And I found that especially in rural communities in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, the evangelicalism it took on a more grassroots, a more sincere form that I found a bit different from what my student church in Cape Town looked like, right?
Interesting, yeah.
That looked a lot more like, it felt a lot more forced. That's how I experienced it. Wow. There was this compulsion. You had to have the compulsion to talk to strangers in the grocery store, and why did I choose this word? Because I for sure cannot say it. Proselytize, right? You had to. It's almost as if someone was keeping a score sheet because someone was. If you had evangelized to someone and they had accepted Christ on the train or on your bus, you would, call the church and let them know what happened, give them their contacts, and then they would follow up. And I'm an introvert to begin with, right? Like if I'm in a store, if I am on my commute, I am minding my business, I have my earphones in, I'm not trying to share the gospel, or everything else that comes with what evangelicalism looks like, right? That I find it to be a very aggressive version of faith or version of Christianity. It's and also that links a lot to, in my mind, that links a lot to the colony and what spreading mission and spreading civilization and spreading Christianity was a conquest in a way. It's the language and just the emotion around that does not resonate with me at all, and does not really resonate with the Jesus that I believe in. So I felt like there were a lot of opportunities to carry guilt and shame in the way that evangelicalism was interpreted in the spaces that I was in South Africa, in the predominantly white spaces, right? So guilt and shame about not doing enough, not serving enough, not getting enough people into the kingdom. Just a lot of like, and trying to get a degree at the same time, and trying to move from I want to say this again. At the same time, trying to get a degree, at the same time, trying to build a life and trying to move upward economically, which is a reality in a lot of African communities. Or the people that were encouraging this, go out, Jesus is the most important thing in your life right now, classes and all of that takes a back seat. They didn't have the same economic realities that I had. They didn't have to make sure that their baby cousins and baby sisters and brothers also went through school. They didn't, our realities were so different. They were predominantly white, which in Africa usually means also middle class or wealthy. We were coming at it from such different angles. My getting an education was something that so many people before me invested in to make sure that we had the resources to, in order to be able to cover the fees and that sort of thing. And that comes with an innate responsibility to pay it forward. Unfortunately, I had a lot of friends who failed in university because they were, the priority was never your school, the priority was Christ, and everything else, seek the kingdom first and everything else will come together. But who's looking up to the everything else when you're the one responsible for that in your family?
Wow. That's interesting. I'm kind of like mapping out a little bit of when I used to think that as well, right. And how I sort of came out of it. And I'm sort of also realizing that partly because I'm an Enneagram too, but also partly because my immigrant experience made me really good at this, which is assimilation. I'm realizing that every chapter of my faith journey, like I've assimilated to sort of the core identity of the faith community I was in.
Yeah.
So for me, when I was in a non-denominational evangelical church, I was very much like, everything I do is for the glory of God, and let's get rid of all the secular music from my iPod.
Oh yeah. Ooh, triggers.
Trigger warning. But I also distinctly remember that I would try to guilt myself into feeling guilty for being a human being.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm like, I need to always be in this idea that I'm like so bad and like, and I'm a crappy person, that Jesus had to die for me, and I have to constantly like live in that liminal space of like guilt and gratefulness. Like I used to try to like guilt myself into becoming guilty. And then when I moved to college, I went to a Christian college, and that's when it was the first time I lived like in a faith community and just spiritual community. And so that's where I started to really like my faith. It very organically morphed into mysticism in so many ways. and just being just that education part of it, especially, just gave me a lot of language and practical tools to really dig deeper. But I'm also in my brain, like my brain's sort of connecting. I was like, there was still parts of that journey or like myself that I remember keeping to myself because it did not match the faith narrative of my community.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And I was like, I was okay with that. I was like, if this feels safe, I'm good with that. And in the past maybe like 5 years, I haven't really had a like formal faith community, and I haven't been a regular churchgoer as well. And it feels like there's like space, like it just feels like there's space, and it can, like, my formal faith identity can be whatever it needs to be. And it's, but especially because in the past 5 years, home has just shifted, and I'm realizing, oh, because you're not in a technically formal faith community, like your faith is, it's kind of like those lava lamps where like it just sort of like wiggles around, like you can just go wherever and be wherever. And so I didn't put together that assimilation and my faith had also had it was very interconnected. I'm curious if does that resonate, or
that's an aha moment. I wrote down assimilation in capitals because that's it. I relate so much with what you were saying. Also, when I was talking about my transition from living in Zimbabwe, then living in South Africa, being part of this predominantly white community. I think if we go back to what you were talking about, that sense of belonging, of having the community tell you you belong, I relate to that as well. And that would have been the driving force of my assimilating, right? So what that looked like for me at that stage was just letting everything that made me like super different, letting that take a step back. So not completely letting it go, right? That looked like speaking so much English all the time, right? And my tongue holds so many languages, but that's the one that was pushed to the forefront. And that goes back to a lot of things that have to do with coloniality as well, right? Where English is, your ability to speak good English makes you intelligent, makes you better, And there's this concept in South Africa or Southern Africa where we describe people, there's a description of a better Black that just means a more palatable version of Blackness, right? A Blackness that doesn't talk too much about the ancestors because that freaks the white people out. A Blackness that has a more white sounding accent, right? Something that they can understand better. A Blackness that waters down or whitewashes names that are difficult for white people to say. And in Southern Africa, we have cliques, right? So like Kakamba, for example, which is a Xhosa name, a beautiful Xhosa name. Kakambas would go by Q because, the white people they cannot pronounce the cliques. So things like that in my own self that just took a step back. And now, having started, the journey towards decolonizing or pursuing what that looks like, and then being in Canada in a new community where I really want to belong, right? Like I really want to be a part of the whole thing. It's, mid-pandemic, we're isolated. I just long for that connectedness. At the same time, I can't rely on what I know to, right? What my mind knows to, what my reflex is, which is to assimilate. I'm so conscious of trying of moments where I feel like my accent is changing and becoming more Canadian. I just I will stop and just it's very important for me not to do that.
Wow.
I was irritated at points when I went back to South Africa this summer, when my friends would say, you sound a bit American, right? Because American is American. And I would just be like, no, 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 no. What did I say? Exactly what was the word? So I changed the way I say things. So it's a struggle for me at the moment to really, that space that you're describing, that you have the space to, your faith can be molded into whatever it wants to look like at this point. For me, I can relate to that, but it doesn't come with a sense of relief or a sense of freedom. It comes with some angst, because then it just goes back to that thing of feeling like the ground that I'm standing on is not solid, it's not stable, but not nearly as jarring as, what I've experienced that to be. And one of the things I was thinking about in preparing for our conversation was that one of the frustrating things for me trying to make this country my home is not being part of a faith community, right? Because it's so easy. It's so easy to build community in church. There's so many opportunities, right? Like Sunday, you sit next to the same person, or, you smile at the same people. Every Sunday, you go to a small group or a Bible study, you volunteer with the same groups. The structure makes building community so much easier. At the same time, I walk into church spaces and none of the way that church is run here is different from the way it's run back home. That was one of my initial reactions. When I moved to Canada, I wrote an article about how for 45 minutes, I sat in the service the first time I attended church in Canada, and it was copy and paste, the same PowerPoint background, the same Hillsong jams, the same scripture passage about, around the offering time, the same altar call, like literally the same structure, which probably belongs more, finds more of a fit here in Canada, in this community, right? But the fact that that's how African services are run, with the same technology, the same songs, in a place of so much diversity. I did not go to a church for at least 6 months. After that, I just needed to, just realistically think, okay, this is what to expect. And it's very difficult because my convictions have not changed. I do not want to be part of a community that perpetuates colonial Christianity or just one version of what it means to be a Christian. At the same time, how do I do that and not be lonely? Oh, okay. She didn't go all the way. She's okay.
Yeah. Oh. Part of me is so grateful that you are struggling with your accent. Because when I moved here when I was 13, so like this in the middle of like teenage hormones, like, right? Like I just wanted to fit in. And so I just I did everything I could to change my accent because I just wanted to be normal and I didn't want to stand out as the immigrant or like the girl with that weird Indian accent. And I did. Yeah. But then, so when 2016, when Trump got elected, I was also kind of unpacking of what it meant to be an immigrant in this country. And I was like, I had this moment of realization. I was like, crap, it's like a random person met me on the street. They're not going to know that I'm an immigrant because of my accent. Yeah. Like I have othered myself from my own community in what I consider my people. Yeah. And for the sake of like belonging to anyone who'd accept me, right? And I grieved for like probably 2 years for the fact that I lost that integral. That it's just like an identity marker, but just so much more than that, right? I think it's you're holding so much history and the legacy and just a lineage that isn't like visible in this new land. So I know it's really hard, but it makes me really happy to hear that you're choosing to stay in that tension and choosing to struggle and choosing to be mindful of how you're speaking.
Right.
Because I think that matters. I think that matters, especially as you're trying to figure out your decolonization process and home and community. Because I think my 13-year-old self is just really grateful that I'm seeing that you're doing that.
Oh, I love that. I really love when you said the way when you're walking down the street or just the way you appear in the world, it holds so much history. That is so good, because I like that the perspective of that is holding history and not the focus of it is not centered on your otherness, right? It's around the richness of just your you-ness is, without any connotations of what it looks like, what it means to be a visible minority. That is so encouraging. I really love that. Yeah.
I'm curious, mostly because I don't know the answer for myself. Is there a relationship for you in this current season of your life, like the relationship between faith, home, and the Bible? And you can say no, because honestly, I have no idea what the answer is for myself yet.
Faith, home, and the Bible. Yeah, I've never thought about this before. I want to say, okay, so I feel like in the, because I'm not part of a faith community, I've read so much Bible since I've moved here. Because that is where it's the primary way that my faith is built, that I remember what I believe. And there's something in the Old Testament stories of the Israelites being wanderers, right? Just moving from place to place, and then something goes down over there and there's drama and can't be here anymore, or like it's just very dramatic, and the pieces are always moving. I feel like those biblical stories of displacement, in a very minute but significant way for me, help me find my place in my faith, that this being a wandering child, it's not anything new. It's not anything that God hasn't dealt with before. I find home in that, which is very abstract, right? Like finding home in Old Testament biblical characters that you can sit down with and have coffee with. But also, I talk back to my Bible a lot. So I listen to an audio Bible. And I would be listening and I would just like pause and be like, what? Listen, this makes sense because of this and this, and this also doesn't make sense. I have entire conversations with them. Yeah, which I'm owning.
Wow. Wow. Oh, I love that.
I like this question. I'd like to think a lot more about it.
Yeah. I just remembered 2 years ago, my mom showed me her grandmother's, my great grandmother's Bible. And it's in our native tongue, Malayalam, but it's like old Malayalam that there were letters even I didn't recognize or know.
Yeah.
And it was like partially tattered and everything. And it was fascinating because I've had a pretty crappy relationship with the Bible past couple of years. Like we don't get along for the most part. But it was just seeing that particular Bible and seeing that like made its way across the country, because like for my mom, like it's just what it represented, not only for my mom and for me, in terms of these are like our last pieces of memories of our ancestors, but also I'm wondering, like, I'm assuming like my great grandmother didn't have a ton of education or a lot of formal theology practices or whatever. And I'm like, I wonder what it was like for her to read it. Like, I wonder what it was like for her. Like, did you find comfort in it? Was this more ritualistic? Like, I'm just kind of sort of, I'm processing out loud right now. And so it's interesting how like the legacy of the Bible is for me in so much not necessarily I won't say not what's in it, but what it represents, like continues to represent in each generation.
Yeah.
I'm wondering like what it was like for her, and what her relationship with, I don't think she moved or like traveled or moved as much necessarily. So what was her relationship with home and faith like?
Right.
Yeah.
That makes me think of, so a big part of my decolonizing my faith right now is how I worship the songs. Realizing that the way that I worshipped was, spoken to God through music has primarily been English, has primarily been songs that are written in the West, and going back to try to find hymns in my native languages, or just worship songs that are not sung in English. And one of my favorite songs at the minute is it's a Xhosa and isiZulu, which are South African languages. A version of Psalm 91, the hymn sung in that language. And the first time I heard it, I remember thinking, what are these words? I did not know that we had words for these specific things, right? And that comes through the same thread of assimilating and, stripping myself of parts of my culture, or letting them take a back seat. And it's so comforting in the sense of like a warm cup of soup on a snowy day, just hearing these ancient words sung in a tongue that carries so much with it, right? That carries a lot of my history, a lot of what makes me who I am, that I've been so disconnected with. But it's just, I when you were speaking, when I made this connection, I was trying to imagine like your grandma worshiping in her language, just this continuation and like passing on the baton in a way. It just feels so sacred. It's just so beautiful. It's so beautiful to be able to hear God's truth, or the truth of who God is, in not English.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's also almost like that song or that psalm. It represents home for you. I mean, it probably is a part of home for you.
Yeah.
That's interesting. The concept of home being the thing that we pass on from generation to generation.
Yeah. I love
Lindy,
that.
I could talk to you for another 2 hours. But we kind of have to wrap up soon, unfortunately. The last question I have for you is, what is liberating you these days?
What is liberating me? The first thing that comes to mind is I'm in a new apartment. I've lived here just for a couple of months, and then I went away for 2 months and came back. So it doesn't feel homey for me at all. And I was dreading decorating because so much stuff in the shops is beige and a certain aesthetic, which is really not me. So what's liberating me right now is making home in my tiny box apartment in Saskatoon, making art, playing with color, talking back to my Bible. And in a significant sense, really the moments where I'm creating and listening to music, whether it's necessarily worship music or not, but just African music, I just feel so free, right? When it's just me and my speaker and some paint or some beads or whatever it looks like at the moment. Because I work from home, I have a desk job, and like it's all very structured, and it's a complex concept because I love the chaos of creating and but at the same time, chaos is not chaos is a stressful thing. So I'm finding liberation in chaos, in the beauty that's in chaos, and in just allowing myself to be molded into, molded is not the word, but just to be more pliable and to play. Because I spent the past couple of years, like most people, throughout this pandemic, just stressed the heck out. And it feels very liberating to create. And you, Leah?
Oh my gosh, this is such a terrible, weird answer. Romance books.
Oh, yes.
I just recently got into this romance genre, and I'm very hooked.
Love this for you, Leah.
But the reason I think it's liberating for me is I think it's twofold. I think since the pandemic, I was never really actively, like, when you say, what does it mean to actively just look for joy? I was like, I have no idea at this point. But then I realized, like, reading books where I know it's going to be a happily ever after, for me, is an act of prophetic imagination.
Oh.
Right?
Yes, I love this.
Yeah, I'm someone who struggles with a lot of anxiety, and a part of it's like everything's going to go, like, just everything's going to burn up soon, and I'm waiting for the inevitable, like, white supremacists to take over this country, and just like there's so much anxiety and so much like negativity that's sort of swirling in my system, and I'm like, I am going to intentionally read a happily ever after book where, like, as cheesy and dumb and unrealistic and problematic as it is, like, love prevails at the end in those books, right? So for me, it's just like an active way of keeping and believing in hope. So it's,
I love it.
Oh, Lindy, this is my soul is filled just chatting with you. It's been so fun.
Me too.
Thanks for listening or watching this episode of Liberating Faith. Lindy is such a beautiful artist, so I will include some of her works in the show notes, and make sure you follow her on Instagram on By Limbo, right?
Yes,
By Limbo. And thanks so much for watching and joining us.
Thanks, everyone. We hope this episode inspired you to choose radical love. We hope these voices cultivated a curiosity that asks questions. Let us walk towards a new humanity together. We invite you to continue the conversation and join our online community of love, kindness, and accountability at She Loves Mag on Instagram. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and review our podcast on whichever platform you're listening from to help us spread the word about liberating faith. If you have any feedback or questions, please email shelovesmagazine@gmail.com. That's shelovesmagazine@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.